everyone, it's Fernanda here. Welcome back to GED On. On today's video, we're going to be covering Chapter 1 of Unit 4, Science. The chapter being Science Practices. Now, this is my personal favorite unit of all time, so I hope that you're as excited as I am. As you already know, the GED On platform was created for you to follow along with the Kaplan book. But if you have not purchased your book already, don't even worry about it. We have provided you with links in the description box below to purchase the book at your local store and online. Because GED On was created through a series of videos, you are more than welcome to pause and replay the videos at any time. Go ahead and do whatever works best for you. Now, if you're ready, let's go ahead and get started with our first lesson. See you there! As a reminder, we will be utilizing the Kaplan GED Test Prep Plus 2020 book for this and all videos offered through the GED On platform. You can find the links below to purchase the book at your local store or online. So before we actually get into our first chapter, I did want to discuss what the Science GED test will be composed of. As far as the test itself, the test is titled Science Test, which is pretty basic, right? The test itself will last approximately 90 minutes. It will be composed of 34 questions that are then composed of reading passages, graphics such as diagrams, tables, graphs, and maps. Each of these questions will be split into 3 content areas. The content areas are life science, which will make up 40% of the test, earth and space science, which will make up 20% of the test, and physical science, which will take up the remaining 40% of the test itself. Now, the content areas will cover a range of different topics and will utilize a range of scientific tools and practices, all of which are covered in the Kaplan book. These particular ranges will then be composed of topics such as the science practices of comprehending scientific presentations, such as interpreting passages in graphics, the scientific method, which will entail designing investigations, reasoning from data, and working with findings, reasoning with scientific information, which will entail evaluating conclusions with evidence, applying concepts and formulas in order to express scientific information and apply scientific theories, and lastly, use of probability and statistics, but specifically within the science context. Okay, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 1, Comprehend Scientific Presentations, Lessons 1 through 6 of Unit 4, Science. You can find these lessons on pages 500 to 517. Let's begin Lesson 1. Comprehend Scientific Presentations. The GED test consists of questions based on science passages and graphics. In order to comprehend science presentations, it is important to understand the importance of main ideas and their supporting details, both topics which we discussed in Chapter 1 of the Reasoning Through Language Arts unit. As a reminder, the main idea of a science graphic and/or presentation is a reflection of the writer's central key point. Science writers support their main ideas with details, facts, and evidence. All right, now that we have retouched on the difference between main idea and supporting details, let's go ahead and look at our first example question. The question itself states, what is the topic of this diagram? As you can see from the image, the diagram itself is of a dry cell battery. Now, if we take a look at the answers, we have to determine what message this particular image or this graphic is trying to send us as the reader, or the learner in this case. Is it A, components of a dry cell battery, or B, how a dry cell battery powers machinery? In this particular scenario, the correct answer is A, the components of a dry cell battery. While the diagram in itself does show different components of a dry cell battery, it does not actually explain in itself how a dry cell battery operates. While it could perhaps be assumed that these are the three components or the three makeups or chemicals that are used to operate a dry cell battery, the image itself does not provide that explanation. Therefore, we can determine that option B is incorrect in this case. Let's go ahead and move on to our second example, where we will review a passage and then answer a question based on the main idea of the passage itself. Let's go ahead and read the passage together. Earthquakes can be classified as either surface earthquakes or deep focus earthquakes. Scientists agree that surface earthquakes occur when rock in Earth's crust fractures to relieve stress. Deep focus earthquakes originate from seismic activity more than 300 kilometers below Earth's surface. The causes of deep focus earthquakes remain a subject of debate, but scientists believe they may be caused by the pressure of fluids trapped in Earth's tectonic plates. Now that we have read our passage, let's go ahead and take a look at our question. Which of the following details supports the main point of this paragraph? Option A is, the causes of deep focus earthquakes remain a subject of a debate among scientists. Option B states, surface earthquakes are caused by stress in Earth's crust, while deep focus earthquakes may be caused by pressure. Given the information that we have found in the passage itself, we can determine that the correct answer to this question is option B. Surface earthquakes are caused by stress in Earth's crust, while deep focus earthquakes may be caused by pressure. The main point of the paragraph is that the earthquakes can be classified into two types, based on how they are caused, and answer B provides supporting details that illustrate the differences between the two types. While answer A is mentioned in the paragraph, it is not the fact that supports the main point about earthquakes classifications. Therefore, it is only a supporting detail. Now that we have finished our first lesson, let's go ahead and move on to practice 1, found on page 501. At this time, please pause the video and read the practice 1 passage found on page 501. When you are ready to restart, click play. All right, everyone. While there are 4 questions for practice 1, we will only be reviewing the first 2 questions in order to provide you the opportunity to work on the remainder of the questions on your own. Let's take a look at the very first question. Which one of the following is the topic of the entire passage? We have 4 options. A, sources of sugar in Americans' diet. B, the role of insulin in metabolizing sugar from food. C, the causes of type 2 diabetes. Or D, How to prevent type 2 diabetes. Let's take a moment to think about that. All right, given the information that we found in the passage, in this case, the correct answer is C, the causes of type 2 diabetes. In the passage, answer A and answer D were not discussed, while option B was mentioned. It solely acted as a supporting detail to the main idea, which is still option C, or the correct answer. Now let's move on to question 2. Which of the following is the main idea of the first paragraph? Again, the first question is asking about the entire passage, while the second question is asking about the first paragraph. Our options are A, it is likely that sugar consumption contributes to the development of type 2 diabetes. B, it is likely that genetic plays a role in the development of type 2 diabetes. C, researchers have discovered the causes of type 2 diabetes. Or D, the causes of type 2 diabetes are not fully understood. After reading the passage, we can determine that the correct answer is D. The causes of type 2 diabetes are not fully understood. The question itself is asking for the main point of just the first paragraph, which provides information detailing that scientists do not fully understand the role played by various factors causing diabetes. Answers A and answers B only provide specific details from the first paragraph. However, they miss the overall point, while answer C contradicts the paragraph itself. At this time, go ahead and pause the video and complete practice questions 3 and 4. Click play when you're ready to continue. All right, we're moving on to lesson 2. Use the scientific method. What is the scientific method? The scientific method is a set of tools and processes that scientists utilize to investigate observable facts and occurrences to acquire new knowledge. The scientific method is used to investigate events and to acquire knowledge. However, it is broken down to a variety of different steps. In this case, in its most basic form, there are 5 steps to the scientific method. Let's go ahead and review each in detail. The first step is observing a phenomenon and formulating a question based on an observation. The formulated question must be something that can be measured. That is, at this point, we're wondering something about something else in its most basic form, and we want to ask a question as far as how it operates. Step 2, collecting data. In this step, you collect data about the phenomenon that is being studied and/or observed. The scientific method is founded on data, also known as observable facts, which are then used to describe the phenomenon itself. Step 3, forming a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess about the answer to the question formulated in step 1. That is, this is an educated guess on why step 1 is actually happening. If we were to know for fact the reasoning behind it, then it would not be part of the scientific method, and it would not be something that we would be observing and then formally then drawing a conclusion to solve it. Step 4, testing the hypothesis through experiment. The experiment itself would be a fair test of the hypothesis and should remain open enough to be adjusted. To adjust the experiment, you could do so by changing only one factor at a time while controlling the other factors. After conducting an experiment, it should be repeated in order to ensure the first results are valid. All right, and the last step is drawing a conclusion. In this step, you need to draw a conclusion about the hypothesis based on the experiment. Once the experiment is completed, you will need to conclude that your hypothesis was supported by the data or that it was not, which is still a conclusion. In this case, a new hypothesis needs to be formulated. Now that we have the basics of the scientific method, let's go ahead and see an example in paragraph format. Alrighty, let's go ahead and take a look at our first example paragraph, which we will read together. The paragraph states, scientists observed unusual plant and algae growth in a pond. They sampled the water and also discovered very high concentrations of bacteria. Significant increases in the growth of plants, algae, and bacteria in ponds are often caused by an excess of phosphates and nitrates in the water. The pond was fairly close to neighboring farmland, and two streams carried water from the farm to the pond. Now, we have two options to choose from when it comes to answering our question, which is, what could be a sound hypothesis about the growth in a pond? Now, as a reminder, a hypothesis is an educated guess as to why something is occurring. So our two options are A, runoff from the neighboring farmland may be carrying excessive phosphates and nitrates from fertilizers to the pond. B is proximity to farmland is the cause of plant and algae growth in ponds and other bodies of water. In this case, if you chose option A, you are correct. The hypothesis is an educated guess about the reason for the unusual plant/algae growth in the pond. It could be tested by an experiment that compares samples from the pond water to samples from streams coming from neighboring fields. In this particular example, choice 2 or choice B is only a general assertion that cannot be measured in this specific situation. So let's go ahead and move on. Now, the scientific method can be broken down into a variety of different factors and variables. A dependent variable is another term to describe the phenomenon which is being observed in the process of the scientific method. On the other hand, the factors which are believed to be affecting the phenomena itself are called the independent variables. In our previous example, the unusual plant and algae growth would be considered the dependent variable, while the runoff itself from the neighboring farm would be the independent variable. Now that we have finished our second lesson, let's move on to practice 2.1, found on page 503. At this time, please pause the video and read the practice 2.1 passage found on page 503. When you're ready to restart, go ahead and click play. Okay, now we've read the passage, so let's put what we know to a test. We're going to go ahead and use the boxes below to identify what the researchers consider to be the independent and dependent variables within the passage itself. As a reminder, the independent variable is a factor that is believed to be affecting the phenomenon, and the dependent variable is the phenomenon itself. Now, let's go ahead and look at our first options. We have option A, which is acne symptoms. Option B, combinations of bacteria. Option C, teenagers. And option D, treatments for acne. Out of these options, which is considered the independent variable? Given what we know about variables and the passage, we can determine that the correct answer is combinations of bacteria, or option B. Now, the dependent variable in this case would be option A, acne symptoms. The researchers were studying the question of how different combinations of bacteria affect acne symptoms. Because the researchers thought acne symptoms might depend on differences in bacteria, acne was the researchers' dependent variable. Combinations of bacteria are not affected by acne symptoms, but the researchers thought bacteria might affect those acne symptoms. Thus, the combinations of bacteria are the independent variable. Now you can pause this video again to complete and review the remaining questions. Go ahead and click on play when you're ready to continue. Go ahead and pause the video and complete practice questions 2 to 4. Click play when you're ready to move forward. All right, so lesson 2 is a little bit of a long one, but the scientific method itself is very intricate and complex. So we're going to go ahead and keep discussing it, but from a different lens. As you may remember, step 2 of the scientific method entails collecting data. In the previous example, the scientists were studying pond water and sampled it. In the passage itself, researchers collected samples of the bacteria from the nasal pores to study acne. A sample is a portion of the entire thing and/or population that is being studied. In most studies, it is often impossible or impractical to study an entire thing or population. That is, it would be really difficult to study an entire pond, as it would entail draining it and potentially then damaging the entire wildlife population within it. While the alternative would be to take a small sample of water from the pond itself. When selecting samples from a thing and/or a population, it is important to ensure that the sample is representative of the population and/or thing being discussed. An unrepresentative sample introduces bias into the results of the study. One way to prevent bias is to select a large enough sample size to reduce the probability that, by random chance, the sample differs significantly from the population and/or thing being researched. Well-designed studies and scientific experiments seek to control for possible sources of biases within their experiments. Let's go ahead and look at our next example. Okay, let's go ahead and take a peek at our example question. Think about the scientists who are studying bacteria in pond water. Which of the following sample sizes is more likely to lead to valid inferences about the pond's water? We have two options to choose from. Is it A, one sample from near the spring that supplies the pond with water, or A again, which is supposed to be B, 10 samples from various places in the pond. In this case, the correct answer is B. Please disregard that A. 10 samples from various places in the pond. If the scientist studying pond water took just one sample of water, that sample might happen to contain only a few bacteria, and thus the scientist will incorrectly conclude that the entire pond has a low concentration of bacteria. On the other hand, if they took 10 samples of water from different places, the samples would likely be different or heterogeneous and more accurately represent the pond as a whole. Okay, like I said, lesson 2 is very long, so let's go ahead and continue with using the scientific method. Randomization is utilized to increase the probability of valid results. Randomization is used to assign the samples to experimental conditions. For example, if scientists conducted an experiment to determine whether pond bacteria grow more in the presence of phosphates, such as those found in the farm runoff, they would begin by taking samples of pond water. Then they would randomly assign half the samples of pond water to a control group, which would receive no treatment. Lastly, they would assign the other half to an experimental group, to which they would add phosphates. Researchers would measure the bacterial growth in both groups and determine statistically whether a difference exists. So as you can see from what we wrote here, the control group is the one thing that you keep under control. So that means you control it under normal conditions. You don't impact it, you don't experiment on it. That's what you compare the things that you actually experiment with to. So let's go ahead and use this information to move on to our next example question. Suppose that researchers above wanted to study whether great amounts of farm runoff correlates with fewer fish in ponds. What do you think they should do? We have two options. Answer A. Identify a random sample of 50 ponds. Order the farmers near half the ponds to limit chemical runoff and order the farmers near the other ponds to increase runoff. Option 2, or answer B. Identify a random sample of 25 ponds where there is a high level of chemical runoff from farms and identify another random sample of 25 ponds when there is a low level of farm runoff. That's a lot of ponds. But given the information that we know, in this case, the correct answer is B. The researchers could not force some farmers to create more runoff in order to make a treatment group of ponds. The farmers would likely not want to change their agricultural practices. In addition, potentially doing environmental damage would be unethical. This is a great example of an observational study, a study in which scientists do not manipulate the conditions. Okay, now that we have finished our lesson, let's go ahead and move on to practice 2.2, found on page 505. Like before, go ahead and pause the video and solve for this question. Once you have answered it on your own, go ahead and click play. Let's take a look at question from practice 2.2. It is formatted as a fill in the blank, which you may also experience in the Science GED test itself. The question states, "An blank involves introducing a change to the treatment group, whereas in an blank, the treatment group is based on current behavior. We have a couple of different options here as far as how we can fill in those blanks. We have option A, which is experiment as the first answer and observational study as the second answer. Option B states observational study is the first answer and experiment is the second answer. C, observational study is the first answer for the fill in the blank, and observational study is also the same answer for the fill in the blank. And lastly, D, experiment as the first answer and experiment as the second answer. Now, just from the context clues alone, we can see that in the statement itself, they utilize the word whereas, which is used to contrast two different things. Therefore, we can determine that the answers are not options C or D, as they list the same terms for both of the answers. Now, that leaves us with option A and option B. In this particular case, the correct answer is option A, experiment and observational study. So let's read back the sentence. An experiment involves introducing a change to the treatment group, whereas in an observational study, the treatment group is based on current behavior. This statement makes sense in accordance to what we have learned prior, where the treatment group or the non-control group is the one that actually experiences the experiment itself. Where if there is a treatment group that is just based on current behavior, that means just based on how it's currently operating, then it is something that's being observed, not changed. In an experiment, the researchers directs the behavior of both treatment and control groups. In an observational study, those groups are selected based on their current behavior, and that behavior is not directed at the researcher. Now that we have answered this question, please take this moment to pause the video and complete the remainder of the practice questions. Go ahead and click play when you're ready to continue. Now that we have reviewed question 1 together, pause the video and complete practice questions 2 and 3. Once you have worked through those on your own, click play to move on. Alrighty, we are moving right along to lesson 3, reason with scientific information. Reasoning with scientific information entails citing specific evidence to provide support to a conclusion. On the other side of the coin, conclusions, also known as scientific theories, can also be challenged by specific data or evidence. The GED science questions may require learners to recognize or cite specific evidence to support such conclusions. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to cite evidence of something that you may not have knowledge about. The test itself will provide you with the context that you need to answer the questions accordingly. Other questions may require learners to make predictions based on evidence, information, and data that is provided throughout the test, just like I mentioned before. Based on trends that are observed through such methods, scientists use data to predict what they believe may occur in the future. Now, our next example is going to give us just that of an example, a prediction, in which we are then going to utilize the question asked to accurately predict what may happen next. Now that we have discussed how to utilize scientific information, let's take a first go at putting it to practice. Our first question is, Which conclusion is supported by the data on the graph? Now, unlike what I mentioned in the prior slide, this is asking us to make a conclusion based on information that we're already provided, not asking us to make a conclusion just kind of out of the air. So it's already giving us two options to choose from. We have option A, which states, the rate of infant deaths in the United States experienced its sharpest decline between roughly 1940 and the late 1950s. The second conclusion states, in each year between 1940 and 2009, there were fewer infant deaths than in the year before. Now let's go ahead and look at this graph where we can determine such an answer. Just by looking at the graph itself, we can determine that infant deaths have decreased between 1940 and 2009. However, as we can see, it has not been a consistent decline. Otherwise, the graph would appear as a straight decline line such as this. In addition, we can see a slight uptick in mortality rates in 1960. Given this information, we can now determine that the correct answer, or actually that the incorrect answer, is B. If we take a close look at the graph between 1940 and the 1950s, we can visibly see that there is a significant sharp decline between this decade. Therefore, to answer the question, we can determine that the correct answer is A. The rate of infant deaths in the United States experienced its sharpest decline between roughly the 1940s and the late 1950s. Now we're going to look at another example using the same graph. Which of the following predictions is based on the graph itself? We have two options. We have option A. Since there has not been an increase in infant deaths since 1960, there will likely be such an increase sometime soon. B. The rate of infant deaths is unlikely to experience sharp decline in the near future. Now, answer A depicts that there has not been an increase in infant deaths since 1960. However, the graph does not state the reasons behind the deaths themselves. Thus, without knowing the factors, we cannot determine that there will be an increase in mortality deaths soon. That's too much of an assumption. However, answer B states that infant deaths are likely to experience sharp decline in the future. While the graph clearly shows that infant deaths have decreased, you can see that the decrease becomes gradual between 2000 and 2009. Thus, it can be determined that there is an unlikely possibility that there will be a sharp decline such as provided by the example of the orange line in the future. Therefore, the correct answer is B. The rate of infant deaths is unlikely to experience sharp decline in the near future. Now that we have finished this lesson, let's go ahead and move on to practice 3, found on page 507. Now that we have moved on to practice 3, go ahead and follow these instructions to solve the question. As you can see, question number 1 is fairly long. Once you have worked through it on your own, go ahead and click play so that we can review it together. Let's go ahead and take our newly learned skills to the next level by looking at our first practice question. It states, inertia causes an object to resist changes in its state of motion. In other words, Inertia causes an object at rest to resist any attempt to set it in motion. Similarly, inertia causes an object in motion to resist any attempt to stop its motion. Objects with greater mass have greater inertia. So we have 4 options to choose from that would allow us to see this in action. We have option A. It would require more effort to break the brick than to break the block of wood. B. If objects were currently sitting still, it would require more effort to push the block of wood across the floor than it would to push the brick across the floor. Option C. If both objects were currently sitting still, it would require more effort to push the brick across the floor than it would be to push the block of wood across the floor. And lastly, option D. The brick would absorb water more readily than would the block of wood. Now, in this particular case, all 4 of these options have different meanings and different causes. However, the only correct answer is answer C. If both objects were currently sitting still, it would require more effort to push the brick across the floor than it would be to push the block of wood across the floor. Oh my gosh, that was hard to say. It sounds like a riddle. According to the passage, a heavier object has more inertia, and the brick is heavier than the block. Therefore, you can conclude that it would be harder to move the brick across the floor. Answer A, breakage, and answer C, absorbing water, were not mentioned. And choice B is the opposite of the correct answer. You may now pause the video to complete the remaining questions. Go ahead and click play when you're ready to start. At this time, go ahead and pause the video, complete practice questions 2 to 4, and click play when you're ready to move on to our next lesson. All right, we're getting closer to the end. Lesson 4, express and apply scientific information. Scientific information can be expressed in different forms. These multiple forms can be words, expressions, graphics, or formulas, among many other things. As such, the GED science test will require test takers to find the relationships among science passages, graphics, formulas, or equations. Such relationships can take the form of scientific equations, such as chemical reactions, which utilize symbols to display their meaning. Speaking of chemical reactions, let's go ahead and take a look at a general chemical equation for what happens when carbon is burned. As seen by our example chemical question, we can see the equation reads as C, or carbon, plus dioxide, or 2 oxygen, equals into carbon dioxide. Now, let's look at the provided question. Which statement describes the process in the equation itself? Our options are A, carbon combines with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, or B, carbon creates oxygen, which takes on another oxygen atom in order to produce a carbon dioxide. Now, when it comes to chemical equations, it's best to break each of the parts down into their own individual formulas, or their own individual compounds in this case, in order to kind of put together the equation in itself. Given that the equation reads as carbon plus dioxide, or 2 oxygen, as can be seen by the 2 under the O, we can determine that the correct answer is A. In this chemical reaction equation, the carbon and the oxygen combined without losing any of their own components. The prefix di means 2. So carbon dioxide means a C and 2 O's. The plus sign on the left, as you can see here, means that the equation indicates that carbon and oxygen are separate reactants, not that the carbon creates oxygen. Therefore, answer B is incorrect. Other types of science questions may ask you to understand a science concept and relate it to a specific situation. Let's take a look at an example of just that. All right, let's take a look at our provided passage. It states, the term desertification describes a chain of events in which so much soil erodes from land that the land can no longer support plant or animal life. The lack of plant life allows for further soil erosion, making the land even more barren. It is very difficult to reserve desertification. So we have two provided options for our given question above. Which of the following could be an example of the early stages of desertification? Is it A, in a certain valley, overgrazing has nearly eliminated plant life. This lack of vegetation has led to rapid soil erosion. Or B, in a certain valley, the climate is arid and soil erosion has occurred when the infrequent rains arrive. Farmers have devised an irrigation system to grow crops and thus reverse the rate of soil erosion. For this particular question, the correct answer is A. In a certain valley, overgrazing has nearly eliminated plant life. This lack of vegetation has led to rapid soil erosion. In answer B, farmers have found a way to combat erosion, so this valley does not appear to be undergoing desertification. Therefore, that answer is incorrect. Now that we have finished our previous lesson, let's go ahead and move on to practice 4, which you will find on page 509. At this time, please pause the video and read the practice 4 passage found on page 509. When you are ready to continue, click play. Okay, so we're going to look at the very first question based on that passage. As you can see, we have a chart of answers to choose from. The question reads, Gillian used one of the vats to test the rate of diffusion of liquid acetone in the process of osmosis. What did she most likely put on the two sides of the semi-permeable membrane in that vat? The passage itself stated that during osmosis, a liquid moves from a place where there is a higher concentration of dissolved material to where there is a lower concentration of dissolved material. Thus, to test the rate of osmosis of a liquid, Gillian would want to put that same liquid on two sides of the vat, with more dissolved material on one side than the other. Therefore, the only choice or answer that describes this is answer C. All right, everyone, 2 more lessons. Lesson 5, use statistics and probability. Scientists often have to perform calculations for their own experiments and observations. Therefore, you can expect to do the same on the GED science test. Such calculations can involve central tendency, which is the average, also known as the mean, median, mode, and range. Scientists use these measures to summarize many pieces of data with a single number. You may also utilize independent and dependent probabilities, counting techniques for combinations and permutations, all of which you can review on pages 288 to 291, in addition to pages 296 through 305 of your Kaplan GED book. Before proceeding, it is recommended that you review these techniques and topics. You can find an overview of such examples of these calculations through these pages. Now, let's go ahead and take a peek at a graph to practice central tendency. The question states, calculate the mean number of tornadoes that struck the Goodland area per year in the years 2002 through 2005. Now, as you can see, they gave us a broad range of years and number of tornadoes to go with them, but it's only asking for a specific time frame. As a reminder, mean is another term for average. Thus, the question is asking us to find the average of the number of tornadoes in the Goodland area between 2002 and 2005. So here we have a table where we have condensed the necessary information. In order to find the average, we need to first find the sum and then divide the sum by the total number of items that we're looking at. If we add the number of tornadoes per year, which is 12 for 2002, 22 for 2003, 16 for 2004, and 18 for 2005, we get a total sum of 68. To get the average from a set of numbers, we must take the total sum of the data offered and divide it by the number of items listed. In this case, it would be the number of years in which we have been asked to observe, or 2002 through 2005, which is 4 years, or 4 items in the case of average. So if we take our total sum of 68 and divide that by the set of number of years, which is 4, that gives us an average of 17, which is the correct answer to this equation. All right, we're now going to move on to practice 5, which you can find on page 511. Please take a moment to pause the video and read the practice 5 passage found on page 511. When you're ready to restart, click play. All right, we will be reviewing the 2 questions provided for practice 5. Let's go ahead and look at these questions together, one at a time. Question 1. Of the species in this graph, which has the median body weight? As you saw in the passage and in the graph, we can see that the rabbit has the median body and weight. As a reminder, the median is the middle number of a set of numbers. The rabbit, in fact, is heavier than the shrew, the cactus mouse, and the fly squirrel. However, it is still lighter than the dog, the human, and the horse. All right, question 2. Of the species in this graph, which has the median metabolic rate? Similarly, the graph shows that the rabbit has the middle metabolic rate of the 7 species in the graph. As you can see, you're really, again, just looking for that middle number among the entire set of data that you're provided, which makes it a little bit easier. You can now take this time to pause the video to complete the remainder of the questions. Go ahead and click play when you're ready to continue. Now that we have completed questions 1 and 2 together, go ahead and pause the video and complete practice questions 3 to 5. Click play when you're ready to continue. All right, woo, we have made it to the last lesson. Lesson 6, construct short answer responses. In addition to calculations, the GED science test may also require that test takers write 2 written responses to a passage, graphic, or combination of the 2. You may take approximately 10 minutes to plan and write each of the 2 possible short answer questions on the GED science test. Lastly, the test may ask you to write a design for an experiment. Given this information, let's discuss a few ways you can prepare to construct short answer responses. Throughout the written portion of the Science GED test, you may be asked to cite specific evidence that supports inferences, conclusions, or analyses of scientific information, and/or you may be asked to design a scientific experiment that will be utilized to test a hypothesis. To answer such questions, responses should contain the following: complete and well-developed explanations, specific facts, details, or evidence from source material, and also, similarly, plans for scientific experiments should include the following: clearly stated hypotheses, a well-formulated design of how the experiment will be conducted, a logical method to collect necessary data, and criteria for evaluation results in relation to the hypotheses. Now, while this may seem like a lot of information, what the scientific method really is trying to do is to create a plan that someone else could replicate. That is, if you were to go from the process of asking a question to then creating a conclusion with all of the other parts of the scientific method in between, you should be able to give that same plan to somebody else and they would be able to replicate the results. So while it may seem like a little bit more work, it actually makes perfect sense as far as to why we have to include so much information if we have to consistently test our hypotheses and our data to ensure that the data is accurate in the end. While most may say that practice makes perfect, only perfect practice makes perfect. Therefore, it is critical that you focus on the process required to answer short answer questions. This aspect is critically important given that each short answer response will take approximately 10 minutes of the total length of the science test, which as a reminder is 75 minutes. Let's break these steps down for you to further absorb the information provided. We'll go ahead and start with step 1. Read the question carefully and put it into your own words. While this advice may seem really obvious, test takers often misread the question due to time constraints, nerves, or discomfort with the material. Therefore, it is suggested that you carefully read the question and then repeat it back to yourself in your own words to ensure that you comprehend what is actually being asked. Step 2. Develop a thesis statement that explains your position or describes your experiment. This step is pivotal in ensuring that your audience comprehends your point of view or position, in addition to providing a precise description of your experiment. While context information is great to help readers understand your stance, it is just as important to keep your message short, sweet, and to the point. Step 3. Reread the information that is provided and use the online highlighter to emphasize the facts, details, and evidence you will use in your response. Highlighting the important aspects of a passage will allow you to not only focus in, but also make sure that you will include only the relevant information in your passage response or your short answer responses. Step 4. Utilize the provided wipe-off board to plan your response. Utilize the wipe-off board as a sort of template or outline before proceeding to completing your response. This will ensure that you will include all necessary information in an organized manner. And lastly, step 5. Write a 1 or 2 paragraph response using online tools such as cut, copy, paste, undo, and redo to improve your work. Just like anything else in life, you should use everything provided to you to ensure that you are successful. This includes the online tools. These tools will allow you to sharpen your answers efficiently and effectively. Hi there. I just wanted to go ahead and check in with you. And no, it's not about the video length time. It's actually about practice 6. Practice 6 is a little bit different than all of the other practice sections that we've covered thus far. It's unique in the sense that it asks you to read 2 passages and then plan and write a 1 or 2 paragraph response. Now, because paragraphs will differ amongst learners, you will be working through this on your own. However, to help you along the way, you can review the writing evaluation criteria, which begins on page 701. All right, everyone, we've made it through. We finally completed chapter 1. But please make sure that you keep going. The next video will cover Unit 4, Science, Chapter 2, Life Science. Before starting the next video, please take some time to complete the provided science practice questions found on pages 514 to 517. These will help you further absorb the information that we have learned throughout this video and put it to practice. We'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.